Who weren't here on Thursday, my name is J.R. Hustwitz. I am a former communications director at the Center for Process Studies, and I'm currently a teacher at Cal State San Bernardino, where I don't allow cell phones in my classroom. Okay. One of the most interesting and exciting things that the Whitehead Research Project is working on right now, and this has been a pipe dream for quite some time, and it's becoming a reality, it's kind of exciting, is the idea of a Whitehead research interface. And I want to just take a few moments to talk about this project and explain it to you. The Whitehead research interface it will be a research tool unlike any other. Deployed online, or even possibly via DVD, it will offer the most comprehensive access to primary and secondary Whiteheadian scholarship. We've actually codenamed this project Eve, after short for Evelyn, which is Whitehead's wife. And there's also some interesting biblical allusions, ties we can make there. In any case, we usually just call this project Eve. It's the sexy name we have for the top secret project. What this research interface will essentially be is a computer program that contains the most comprehensive array of, as I said, primary and secondary materials we have. We can actually gather in regards to Whitehead's work. It would include new editions of Whitehead's complete works, annotated and cross-referenced, available in digital format, as well as an opportunity to order hard copies through the interface. The program would also have cross-references to other philosophers, artists, writers, etc., to which Whitehead refers in his texts. The complete contents, ideally, of the Whitehead archives and special collections at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and the Center for Process Studies. This includes letters, artifacts, anything that's actually in these archives. Apocryphal materials, for example, Lucian Price's dialogues or the lecture notes of students who have attended Whitehead's lectures. An extensive Whiteheadian lexicon. And actually, Dr. Cobb has just recently published a fantastic little book. The title is
Whitehead Word Book, I believe. The glossary.
The Whitehead Word Book, which is a glossary. So we've already started on that project also. The interface will also contain a dynamic, constantly updated catalog of institutions, centers, journals, and programs devoted to Whitehead studies. A comparative collection of visual diagrams of Whiteheadian concepts. I always thought this was interesting. Some people draw actual occasions as arrows, some people draw them as spirals, other people draw them as little circles. But we will have a museum gallery of all the different diagrams that are available to you to conceptualize your actual occasions. Also organize a list of internet resources, links to web pages, online articles, multimedia, discussion boards, etc. The thematic bibliographies that we already have at the Center for Process Studies, and also links to online bookstores that offer Whitehead's texts for sale. Even calendars of relevant events, conferences, seminars, a discussion forum dedicated to guiding structures of discussion, and even, if we can work this out, visual recreation of the places and times of Whitehead, for example, his houses, his universities, his birthplace, grave, friends, family, and colleagues. We basically have a virtual recreation of the entire intellectual world of Alfred North Whitehead. Now, this is obviously an extremely ambitious project, but I'm happy to report that we are making progress. For example, if you go to the whiteheadresearch.org website, we already have links to many of Whitehead's primary works in a digital format, and we're currently have a collection of notes, lecture notes from the students of Whitehead from the 1920s that are being scanned and transcribed in the digital format also. Okay? So the process is well underway. Now, the way this Whitehead Research Interface would work is that given any simple query, those of you who've used Google are familiar with the search engine, Eve, or the Whitehead Research Interface, will provide an exhaustive list of pertinent resources. These resources will be semantically disambiguated. That is, organized according to user-specified criteria and or research type. So for example, if I were to enter the word Buddhism into the query field, Eve would return under separate headings. First, pertinent sections from the lexicon that give a basic definition of this term. Annotated and cross-referenced chunks of primary text from Whitehead's book that mentions Buddhism. Any correspondence or other materials in the archive or apocrypha that mention or pertain to the phrase. Any and all entries in the thematic bibliographies that pertain to the key words. Information about institutions that offer courses or programs concerning Whitehead Buddhism. Links to online resources that are relevant. Links to purchase books on the topic, a list of events that pertain to Whitehead Buddhism, and finally, a link to do a simple Google search for Whitehead and Buddhism. This option is last because Google searches, while up to date, are not graded according to relevance, resource type, or difficulty. So the interesting thing about the Whitehead Research Interface is not only the comprehensive breadth of material available, but also the way in which you're able to access the material. It's dynamic. It's not just syntactic, it's semantic, right? It's disambiguated, it's dynamic. And we've been looking at very interesting sort of animated interfaces to sort of navigate all these sort of different spheres of ideas. So it's a really exciting project. I just want to take a few minutes to let you guys know the Whitehead Research Project has very exciting things in store for us. And with that, I'm going to sit down and hand the floor over to our program for today. So thanks very much for your time.
Good morning, I'm Lehman McHenry from California State University Northridge. I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers this morning. Professor Jean Cather from the University of Freiburg. For German speakers, please excuse my English pronunciation. And Professor Brian Henning from Gonzaga University. Professor Cather will be talking on the web of life and the constitution of human identity, rethinking nature as the main issue of Whitehead's late metaphysics. And Professor Henning, recentering process thought, recovering beauty in A. of Whitehead's late work. I think these two papers will dovetail together rather nicely. Both concern similar issues of aesthetics and ethics. One comment that we note is I only received Professor Cather's paper late yesterday, so I don't have prepared comments about it. I read it over verbatim this morning. So I think what I'll try to do, instead of responding to both papers, is just save my comments to the end and try to integrate them together. So we'll just immediately have questions after Professor Cather's paper.
Yes, good morning. I hope you slept well, though I heard that some of you slept only very shortly. In 1934, a small book with the title Nature and Life was published. The two lectures, which first had been held at the University of Chicago in 1933, became the third chapter of Modes of Thought published in 1938. Their new publication and the integration of the lecture in a broader frame of ideas shows that even in his late years, the elaboration of philosophy of nature, which transcends the narrow frame of science and overcomes the dualism of matter and mind, as well as a materialistic reductionism, had a high priority for Whitehead. In my opinion, it is the central theme and the heritage of Whitehead's whole philosophy. Already in 1920, a book with a characteristic title, Concept of Nature, was published. Though it is an epistemological interpretation of the theories of modern physics, Whitehead distinguishes already philosophy of science, which he still identifies as philosophy of nature, from the methodology and the contents of metaphysics, and that means his later philosophical cosmology. Science and the epistemological reflections on science take nature for granted and do not reflect on the knowing subject, its intentions, feelings, needs, and visions. Science, as Whitehead puts it, is the philosophy of the thing perceived. It is awareness of something, of an object. But if cosmology, as for example Newlands puts it, aims at articulating the universe as a whole, it has to embrace the knower and the known. It is therefore, as Whitehead writes already in Concept of Nature, the special task of metaphysics to embrace subject and object. Consequently, its range of application is wider than that of science and epistemology. But human identity cannot be based on mental acts. Humans are living beings. They are not standing as an external observer outside of the universe, but they are physically and mentally an integral part of it. Every action and every thought changes the universe imperceptibly, but irreversibly. Beyond this, the act of knowing never can be described completely by an external observer. It cannot be objectified. Therefore, a philosophical cosmology has to deal with the physical structure of the universe and with those aspects of experience which refer directly to humans as living, feeling, and thinking beings. It has to deal with aesthetic dimensions, ethical values, with the origin and the final aim of human existence. In contrast to science, in art, ethics, and religion, subject and object cannot be separated completely of each other, as the German philosopher Ernst Cassirer has demonstrated. Consequently, Whitehead gives, in Process and Reality, published in 1929, a more detailed definition of the function of metaphysics as philosophical cosmology. It has to be one of the motives of a complete cosmology to construct a system of ideas which brings the aesthetic, moral, and religious interests into relation with those concepts of the world which have their origin in natural science. Still in his late book, Modes of Thought, Whitehead argues that science, due to its method, cannot cover aims, feelings, and values. In the terminology of modern epistemology, science deals only with the perspective of the third person, not with the perspective of the first and second person. Because every method reveals only a fragment of nature, Whitehead tries, also in his late writings, to connect scientific theories to those insights which are immediately bound to the experiencing individual. Nevertheless, we can observe a certain shift in the focus. Though Whitehead has already in Process and Reality, by means of the concept of actual entity, elaborated a new synthesis of matter and mind, of efficient and final causation, and of determination and freedom, first in Nature and Life and Modes of Thought, the concept of life and its ethical dimension comes to the fore. He writes, the key notion from which such construction of systematic metaphysical cosmology should start is that the energetic activity considered in physics is the emotional intensity entertained in life. During the last 300 years, the relation of humans to nature, of body to mind, and of matter and to spirit was dominated either by dualism or materialistic reductionism. All material objects, the bodies of living beings included, have to be explained scientifically from the viewpoint of an external observer. Even today, a lot of philosophers of the analytical and the hermeneutical school argue that the whole range of entities can be classified only by means of two categories: objects, which can be localized in space and time, and persons, which are endowed with rationality, self-consciousness, consciousness of time, and language. But to which category belong plants and animals, babies and humans with dementia? Obviously, they are neither objects nor persons. On the background of the bifurcation of nature, humans cannot understand themselves at the same time as part of nature and as beings endowed with reason. Either the knowing subject is reduced to mental acts and has a body whose functions are explained by the laws of physics, or mental acts are interpreted as epiphenomenon of the brain. Consequently, nature has no intrinsic value. Values are based on utilitarian goals or rational consensus, and aesthetics is reduced to subjective feeling. But the philosophical theories mentioned above are opposed to some of the most fundamental insights on the theory of evolution and of modern ecology. If humans are indeed with their body and their mind part of nature, the dualism of person and object, as well as reductionism, has to be overcome. As the German philosophers Helmut Plessner, Max Scheler, and Hans Jonas, Whitehead rediscovers the concept of life, which was very important for the cosmology of antiquity, and which mediates between lifeless things and self-conscious persons. Obviously, in the process of evolution, a being has developed which is endowed with self-consciousness. Though living and acting in the midst of the world, humans can reflect on the universe, on themselves and their origin. But the human body cannot be conceived as an object that can exactly be localized in space and time. By metabolism, qualitative perceptions, and intentional acts, it is in permanent exchange with the surrounding. The body is not a passive instrument of actions, it is felt from within qualitatively. It is the lived body which becomes the medium of the expression of needs, feelings, and intentions. The physiological functions explained scientifically and the lived body belong inseparably together. Whitehead writes, our bodies lie beyond our individual existence, and yet they are part of it. Thus we arrive at this definition of our bodies. The human body is that region of the world which is the primary field of human expression. Human identity is a unity of body and mind, it is bipolar, and it depends from the interaction with its environment. On the one hand, humans are embedded in the biosphere, which is constituted by the complex interrelation of a multitude of organisms and inorganic material. Under this perspective, nature, its laws, and its history belong to the conditions of the possibility of knowledge. On the other hand, physical needs and the leading goals of culture influence the complex interplay of the organisms in the biosphere. As living beings, humans are, spoken in the terms of modern biology, open systems. But again, we have to take into consideration the limits of scientific definitions. Human life cannot be described adequately by feedback loops. Humans know from their direct experience, and they have qualified sensations, feelings, and aims. Following the theory of evolution, the human form of consciousness did not arise in a sudden jump out of bare matter. It has developed step by step from simple forms of consciousness, of feeling, and of sensitivity. The multitude of species can be derived from the simplest living organism, the solitary cell. Humans share approximately 70% of their genes with mice, and approximately 98% of their genes with those of the great apes. Although a lot of books often mention only three characteristics of life: metabolism, reproduction, and the mutation of genes, most biologists add another one: irritability, the sensitivity for signals, and the capacity to steer the motions according to qualified perceptions. The solitary cell is the first living being that is separated from the world by a membrane, and that is at the same time related to the world by needs and the sensitivity for signals. In the words of Whitehead, it is bipolar, it has a mental and a physical pole. Neither is mind a substance, as in the philosophy of Descartes, nor is it an epiphenomenon of matter. It is a function of the whole organism. On the one hand, every living being is separated from the world, and on the other hand, it is related to it. The external world is present in the inner world as data for needs and aims. But qualified sensations are not enclosed in the inner world. They are expressed in bodily motions, sounds which can be heard, and actions which influence the environment. As Whitehead puts it, the world is included within the occasion in one sense, and the occasion is included in the world in another sense. For example, I am in the room, and the room is an item in my present experience. But my present experience is what I am now. Life is essentially based on the process of unification by permanent self-transcendence. The inner autonomy of an organism is based on the interrelation with the surrounding. Therefore, internal and external relations are constitutive for every organism. Living beings which are sensitive to their needs and for dangers feel the difference between fulfillment and failure. The struggle for life is by no means only the function of a system. It is motivated by the vital interest of an organism, its will to live. To be or not to be are no longer equivalent. Life is not a mere succession of rules. It implies the striving for an aim, for being, and beyond this, for well-being. Thus, so Whitehead, the characteristics of life are absolute self-enjoyment, creative activity, aim. Events are not perceived as neutral facts. They have a meaning for an organism striving for survival and well-being. To attain this goal, the physical adaptation to the environment is not sufficient. An organism has to distinguish between different opportunities and to concentrate on one of them. At least on a very low level, intelligence is required. Concentrated attention, so Whitehead, means the disregard of irrelevancies, and such disregard can only be sustained by some sense of importance. Thus, the sense of importance or interest is embedded in the very being of animal experience. Already one-celled beings, like Amöbia or Giardia, can adapt to the environment actively by steering their movement. And, as modern observations have demonstrated, already plants can steer the motions of their leaves and react on subtle differences in their environment. Therefore, together with the physiological complexity, consciousness has evolved, as Whitehead argues. Importance generates interest. Interest leads to discrimination. In this way, interest is increased, and the two factors, interest and discrimination, stimulate each other. Finally, consciousness develops gradually and fitfully, and it becomes another agent of stimulation. Obviously, the evolution of consciousness is one of the most important characteristics of the process of evolution. Therefore, all living beings are not only related to one another by the genetic code, but also by their inner life and their behavior. In contrast to lifeless objects, living beings cannot be described completely from the standpoint of an external observer. Qualified perceptions of the world and of one's own state, subjectivity, in a very broad sense, is not only constitutive for humans, but for every living being. Consequently, the concept of life has to embrace physiological processes and mental acts, causal reactions on the data of the environment, and the feeling of meaning and well-being. The concept of life includes the capacity to self-causation. If nature would be completely determined by causal reactions, it would be dead, moved by mechanical forces only. Complete conformity, as Whitehead writes, means the loss of life. The striving for self-enjoyment pushes on the process in which the many perceptions are again and again unified in one organism. Therefore, Whitehead describes life as an ongoing process of self-creation. The present conditions are transcended by the permanent striving for fulfillment and the realization of one's own possibilities. The process of life is not based on the mere exchange of different states and entities. It aims at the creation of growing physical and mental complexity, at the intensification of life. But novelty can arise only on the background of the past. the identity of an organism and of humans too is based on the relation to a multitude of beings which have existed in the past and which are coexisting in presence. On the one hand, the past restricts the frame of possibilities. On the other hand, it is the basis for new decisions, which irreversibly influence the conditions of future beings. The great chain of being is not only a vertical hierarchy, as in antiquity and medieval ages. It reaches from the past to the future and relates the single self with humans. Therefore, humans who can reflect on their intentions and actions are responsible for them, and beyond this, for the conditions of life of the future generations. In integrating past and present in a decision, every organism obtains a universal dimension. Nevertheless, it selects and integrates the data under its very special point of view. Thus, it is in its universality irreplaceably individual. Life is, as Hans Jonas puts it, self-centered individuality. The ongoing process of decision and integration generates the connexity of the world. No living being can be conceived as an isolated substance. Every living being is embedded in a very special environment. It depends on it and transforms it. The environment will change if a species is extinct or a new species evolves. Nevertheless, qualified perceptions are not only useful for the struggle for life and for genetic reproduction. Every organism has an intrinsic aim, its being and well-being. If the subjective dimension of life is taken into consideration, the concept of being changes. And then the separation of being and ought, which has arisen on the background of science, can be overcome. The life of an organism is by no means a neutral fact, but it has an intrinsic meaning. Though the human form of consciousness is able to rational understanding, it is by no means completely different from the mind of lower beings. Humans, as Whitehead argues, are bodily and mentally part of the web of life, which is constituted by a multitude of different entities. If nature is conceived as bipolar, humans can understand themselves as part of nature and as beings endowed with reason. Yet, we still have to deal with a problem which often is discussed in epistemology. We only know, so the argument, from ourselves what it means to feel pain and pleasure, to be motivated by interest, and to be disappointed about their failure. The qualities felt by other humans or living beings, for example by a bat, cannot be felt directly. Nevertheless, for Whitehead and Cassirer, Jonas, Scheler, and Plessner share his arguments, the knowledge concerning the inner life of fellow creatures is not based on mere analogy. It is essential for every living being to express its inner life more or less directly by motions, gestures, voice, or gaze. Expression therefore reveals if something is alive. Whitehead writes, wherever there is a region of nature which is itself the primary field of expression issuing from each of its parts, that region is alive. Feelings and emotions are not enclosed in the brain or the nerve system. They are not only perceived by the perspective of the first person, they are expressed physically. Therefore, even the physical appearance of an organism cannot be interpreted only in physiological concepts. The body is by no means, is not the means, but the medium of the expression of the inner life, of the meaning an event has for an individual, and of its needs and wants. In its physiological functions, the body is at the same time the lived body, which expresses feelings, moods, and intentions visibly. The physical appearance of an organism represents a meaning which can be understood emotionally or even mentally by other living beings which can respond to it by their actions. The bodily expression of the inner life is the basis for the communication between different individuals of the same species, and even between the members of different species. Language is only a very special form of expression which is bound to symbols. Therefore, organisms are related to each other by physical and mental interaction. They exchange information, learn from each other, and pass their knowledge down to the next generation. Even in this respect, the concept of symbol location has to be overcome. It cannot be denied that living beings must struggle for existence, and that resources may be scarce. Nevertheless, it would be one-sided to conceive life as permanent fight with claws red from blood. Every organism depends on the activities of a multitude of fellow creatures. Its life depends essentially on the cooperation of different species and individuals, an insight which modern biology approves. Whitehead writes, "Those organisms are successful which modify their environment so as to assist each other." Consequently, nature can no longer be described only by meaningless rules and causal reactions. The dynamic of life includes meaning and aim, which is completely independent of human intentions. This insight transforms the relation of humans to nature and at the same time their self-understanding. Human life depends on the activities of a multitude of other species in the past and present. They share a lot of needs and emotions with them and therefore even can communicate with them. They are embedded in nature as a meaningful process. We find ourselves, so Whitehead, in a buzzing world amid a democracy of fellow creatures. Therefore, ethics cannot remain anthropocentric. It also has to embrace the intrinsic values and interests of their creatures. As members of the great community of life, they have rights for their own. For Whitehead, values have three different aspects. First, every individual is striving for being and self-enjoyment. It is, so Whitehead, the essence of life that it exists for its own sake, as the intrinsic reaping of value. Second, every organism is the basis for the self-creation of other organisms. Though it has an intrinsic value, it has at the same time a function for the existence and the self-enjoyment of other living beings. The more complex the environment of an organism, the higher the grade of intensity it can attain. We are, so Whitehead, each of us, one among others. Finally, every organism has a value for nature as a whole. Again, Whitehead, all of us are embraced in the unity of the whole. Therefore, not only individuals and their fellow creatures, but even nature as a whole has an intrinsic value. Values are not, or at least not only, constituted by humans, but transcend the narrow horizon of their interests and arguments. They become a sign of infinite being. But though values are inherent everywhere in nature, their realization depends on the complexity of an entity. Therefore, the main difference between animals and humans is the grade in which values are recognized and practiced consciously. Especially human life is no longer concentrated on the struggle for survival. The growing freedom from physical and emotional reactions can lead to a conscious striving for the realization of values. For Whitehead, nature has beyond its intrinsic value also an aesthetical dimension. The unity of organisms is based on the integration of contrasting elements, but unity does not mean uniformity. On the one hand, inconsistencies would destroy the unity of an organism and cause stress and suffering. On the other hand, the lack of contrast is a sign for the lack of complexity and intensity of life. In the process of unification, a complex and dynamic synthesis of whole and parts evolves. There is a whole arising from the interplay of many details, Whitehead writes. The whole is not composed by the mechanical addition of parts, and it cannot be dissected into its parts. The whole is, as a famous saying says, more than the sum of its parts. But even beauty is not static. It arises in the ongoing process of self-creation of a living being, and it vanishes when the organism dies. But as long as the process of nature is going on, again and again beautiful forms will emerge at other places and another point of time. Therefore, beauty is not only bound to the individual organism. The striving for aesthetic perfection belongs to the ongoing process of integration of entities which pushes the process of evolution on. Therefore, for Whitehead, nature as a whole cannot be divorced from its aesthetic values. The aesthetic dimension of nature is not only based on abstract mathematical symmetries, but also on sensual qualities, on colors, the visible interplay of different forms and sounds. Due to the theory of apprehension, they are on the one hand relevant for the constitution of an organism, and on the other, and of the order of nature, of its stability and functioning. On the other hand, they are relevant for the self-enjoyment of a living being. The aesthetic experience is another mode of the enjoyment of self-evidence, Whitehead writes. Aesthetic values, therefore, have at the same time a subjective and objective aspect. The meaning of the beauty of structures and of values transcends the advantage for the struggle of life and daily well-being. For Whitehead, it belongs to the ongoing process in which finite entities again and again integrate the complex of the universe and strive for totality. Therefore, at least for humans, ethical values and aesthetical dimensions in nature become a visible sign for the inexhaustible process of self-creation in which finite entities transcend themselves to infinite being. Let me summarize. In Whitehead's philosophy of nature, values and aesthetical dimensions belong to nature. They impede that nature is conceived of as mere resource for human interests and needs. On the contrary, nature itself is a basis for the development of the ethical and aesthetical sensitivity of humans. Especially for modern ecology, it is important that the functional aspect of nature is not separated from its intrinsic and aesthetical values. Therefore, the beauty of an ecosystem can be interpreted as an expression of the complex interplay of a multitude of organisms. It is the basis for regeneration and ongoing self-creation. Thank you very much.
15 minutes for questions?
No.
No? Okay, afterwards, all right. So I'd like to introduce Professor McKenna.
Good morning. We come to the end. I'm really enjoying being able to reflect on Whitehead's later works, and I really appreciate all of the very thoughtful papers and getting to meet such wonderful scholars. So I'll jump right into our project here. In Whitehead's brief preface to Adventures of Ideas, we get, I think, a rare window into how he conceived his own work, and the passage has come up a few times already. He's noticing that we can read these three books, Science and the Modern World, Process and Reality, and Adventures of Ideas together, and that they supplement each other's omissions and compressions, he says. I think if I'm correct, one of the most important concepts in process thought is almost absent from Process and Reality, and that is beauty, which is one of the central concepts for Adventures of Ideas. I've always been struck by the strength of this passage, that the teleology of the universe is directed at the production of beauty. My claim isn't that beauty it first appears in Adventures of Ideas. It doesn't. But I've been trying to think through taking what it looks like to take seriously Whitehead's claim, rather than taking it as hyperbolic or metaphorical. what Whitehead's work looks like if we take it seriously, and I think it's actually something to be embraced rather than to be qualified or explained away. So I adopt Frederick Farray's rather fortunate phrase of describing Whitehead's work as callogenic, beauty generating. Though there are notable exceptions, surprisingly few process scholars have recognized and embraced the significance of Whitehead's claim. Indeed, beauty is notable in its absence from most of the major works on process metaphysics, which works tend to focus on Whitehead's Science in the Modern World and Process and Reality. Perhaps varying charges of aestheticism, which others have brought up, Stephen in particular. Those who do note the centrality of beauty have mistakenly sought either to minimize its significance or to explain it away as metaphorical embellishment, notwithstanding the more robust notions of metaphor I don't think are being used in those instances. The goal of this brief essay then is to defend the view that process thought, particularly process ethics, which is my main concern, will be more adequate and applicable if it is recentered around the concept of beauty. So just quickly, many of you, I apologize if many of you already know this well, but it's just helpful to have it out on the table. Whitehead defines beauty as the dual aim at harmony and intensity. The subjective aim of every occasion is at the achievement of the most harmonious and intense experience possible. Harmony for Whitehead is what he says, the minor form of beauty, and is understood as the, quote, absence of mutual inhibition among the various prehensions that constitute an experience. So the aim at harmony is at maximally inclusive unity in diversity. That's what he defines harmony. And if the inclusion is too great, there is, as he puts it, a painful clash. An experience risks degenerating into chaos. On the other hand, if inclusion is too limited, the deficiency of diversity results in tameness or monotony, he says. Yet Whitehead insightfully and rightly notes the absence of mutual inhibition, this minor form of beauty, is not sufficient to achieve deeply beautiful experience. Beauty requires not only the absence of conflict, not only harmony, but also the realization of new contrasts. We need intensity. It is through the realization of pattern contrast that, he says, new conformal intensities of feeling are achieved. It is this aim at intensity where the depth and richness of experience is purchased. Quoting Adventures, he says, thus the parts contribute to the massive feeling of the whole, and the whole contributes to the intensity of feeling of the parts. So each occasion of experience aims at the achievement of beauty in the sense that it seeks to bring the elements within its actual world together in a way that avoids the painful clash of conflicting ends, and furthermore seeks to relate these elements together in such a way as they not only avoid the conflict of mutual inhibition, but deepen the intensity of experience felt through the introduction of these new patterned contrasts. As a unique achievement of harmony and intensity, every occasion of experience is then to some degree beautiful. The zero of beauty, as Hartshorne noted, is the zero of actuality. In determining itself, every occasion necessarily achieves some degree of beauty and is, to that extent, justified in its existence. Yet it is still very much the case that an occasion of experience can fall short of the maximally unified diversity and balanced complexity open to it. It is, in that sense, then ugly. Whitehead fully recognizes that ugliness is all too real in our finite world. The ugliness of violence, what Whitehead calls aesthetic destruction or discord, involves the destruction of achieved forms of beauty and the realization of new forms. As Whitehead rarely notes, the great novelty and intense beauty achieved by living occasions is only possible through such violence. For this reason, although tragic, violence is preferable, he argues, and I tend to agree that violence is preferable to the sweet anesthetic death of experience, in which an occasion embraces lower forms of beauty when higher forms are possible. This embrace of what he calls tameness, or anesthesia, is far more destructive in the long run, for it cuts against, in his nice phrase, the very essence of the universe. And as the aim of the creative advance of the universe, then I think beauty should be seen as a central category of Whitehead's system. I briefly, and I think I'm going to skip actually the little discussion on creativity because I don't really flesh it out anyway. I just think, I tend to think that using beauty as a primary category does a better job of explaining this difficult category of creativity from process and reality. So I find it to be helpful, and we can, I suppose, focus on that, but focusing more on ethics then. So I have no doubt that the study of process metaphysics would benefit from being recentered around the concept of beauty. My main concern is the rather unfortunate effect that the omission of beauty has had on the development and defense of a Whiteheadian moral philosophy. Indeed, I will argue that much of the neglect of process ethics among contemporary moral philosophers and environmental ethicists is ultimately traceable to process scholars' refusal to recognize fully the callogenic nature of process. Indeed, process ethics, insofar as there is such a thing, I think, has actually largely failed. Despite near unanimous agreement among process scholars regarding the worth of a process approach, process ethics has failed to capture the interest or attention of mainstream philosophers. Nowhere is this failure of process ethics more apparent and more disappointing than in the area of environmental ethics. Whereas a process approach never gained significant attention from mainstream moral philosophy, process scholars were present at the very inception of environmental ethics. For instance, two of the most eloquent and insightful proponents of process thought, Charles Hartshorne and John Cobb, contributed to the first anthologies dedicated to the topic. In the late 60s and early 70s, their work was included in the first issues of the Journal of Environmental Ethics. They were there at the very birth of American environmental philosophy and were included as significant contributors. According to Eugene Hargrove, the founding editor of the Journal of Environmental Ethics, the first dissertation on environmental ethics in the United States was written on Whitehead, entitled The Rights of Non-Human Beings, a Whiteheadian Study in 1976. So, despite the innovative and groundbreaking work by process scholars at this time, it's increasingly rare to find a process perspective represented in mainstream anthologies and course texts on ethics and on the environment. Including, if you look at my footnotes, including the person who wrote the 1976 dissertation on the environment doesn't include Whitehead in her own anthology. Really irritates. Despite the innovative and groundbreaking work we have here, right, I think we have to wonder what happened. Despite the innovative and groundbreaking work, it's increasingly rare, so I count myself among those who see process thought as an ideal basis for developing a rich moral philosophy, so I'm particularly concerned about figuring out what happened. Why is it so roundly ignored? It's not as though we're trying to break into an area, which is so often the case with Whitehead, but rather we were there, so something else, I think, is to be to blame. In an important sense, I would argue first that process ethics has failed because it never really was systematically developed. To be sure, many capable scholars have written wonderful essays, dedicated chapters to the topic, yet very few scholars have taken on the project of systematically developing a Whiteheadian moral philosophy. And those who do, I think, have largely refused to recognize the central role of beauty. I think David Griffin's work is a good example of both of these trends, the lack of systematic development and the refusal to give beauty a central role. I take as examples Griffin's 2001 Re-Enchantment without Supernaturalism and his 2007 Whitehead's Radically Different Postmodern Philosophy. In both of these, he dedicates a chapter to Whiteheadian ethics. In the former, that is in Re-Enchantment, Griffin rightly notes that, quote, satisfaction is discussed in terms of the aesthetic criteria of beauty. There's harmony and intensity. Experience that is aesthetic in this sense is said to be the whole point of existence, Griffin writes. Despite his recognition that the whole point of existence is the achievement of beauty, in his more recent project, Griffin effectively omits the concept of beauty. It doesn't play any significant role in the 2007 book, which is excellent, by the way. It's out there. You should get a copy if you don't have it. Yet even in Re-Enchantment, where he recognizes the importance of beauty, Griffin inexplicably, to my mind, denies that beauty is the aim of morality. In the note there, I argue, and maybe I should emphasize now, I think he makes the mistake of making beauty incoherent. He grants that it's the aim of process. Process aims at the achievement of beauty, but then, like Lynn Belayev before him, denies that ethics aims at beauty. But that makes human activity, human ethical action, incoherent in the sense that it is inexplicable in terms of the categories of the system. Human activity, ethics, morality should be an exemplification of the same principles at work in the universe. If all processes aim at the achievement of beauty, human action also aims at necessarily the achievement of beauty. And I must be missing something. I have difficulty understanding this this position. Griffin's odd position seems to be motivated, I think, less by Whitehead's own claims, which are, to my mind, unambiguously in conflict with Griffin's, than by his desire to avoid the view that Whitehead's ethics is utilitarian. There seems to be, right in those passages, motivating him, his interest in claiming that it's not utilitarian. So I suggest perhaps in his mind he's worried about Claire Palmer's work, categorizing Whitehead as utilitarian, but she's not concerned with beauty. I think she focuses on process theology of contributionism to derive her characterization of Whitehead's work as utilitarian. So beauty seems to me to be a red herring. But Griffin is not here, but I can beat him up nonetheless. Griffin's reactive approach is characteristic, in fact, though, of most process scholars. So he's just meant to be an example. Instead of systematically exploring the unique contours of a callocentric Whiteheadian ethic, process scholars more often ask how Whitehead's work is like or unlike some existing moral paradigm. In hindsight, the effect of this tendency is predictable. Because process scholars have not positively and systematically developed a Whiteheadian approach to morality, we have allowed others to characterize it. The results are as diverse as they are mutually contradictory. For instance, process ethics has, over the last 4 decades, been characterized as selfish individualism, a moral interest theory, a consequentialist, maximizing, totalizing form of utilitarianism, a deontological ethic, a deeply ecological ethic, a land ethic, and a clandestinely anthropocentric version of moral extensionism, to name a few. The failure to systematically develop a Whiteheadian moral philosophy has allowed others to define it for us with insalubrious results. It isn't enough to suggest how a process position would address particular problems or point to a few of the contours of Whiteheadian approach, although that's important too. We need finally to begin the long and difficult work of systematically developing a Whiteheadian moral philosophy, and I would argue the first step in doing this is more fully embracing the central role of beauty. Indeed, we will find that only by adopting a fully callocentric approach can process thought address the root cause of the neglect of process ethics. And my second claim then is that not only is it the failure to develop systematically, but actually the more subtle reason why Whitehead has been marginalized and ignored is it's continued to insist on or embrace a hierarchical notion of value. So beyond this failure of systematic development, I'm convinced that it's this hierarchical conception of value that's the problem. Despite the unpopularity of this position, this hierarchical view of value, process scholars have generally been steadfast in their insistence that complex judgments of value are necessary and in fact unavoidable in the daily course of life. They rightly, I agree, they rightly recognize that it is metaphysically irresponsible and ethically dangerous to refuse to recognize that there are differences in the degree of beauty and value achievable by different occasions of experience. John Cobb's been very eloquent and persistent rightly in this point. The richness of experience achievable by the occasions defining a dandelion are significantly shallower than those achieved by a Labrador retriever, the other animals running around our hotel. Because of the greater complexity and integration of its parts, a dog, for instance, is capable of far richer and more beautiful experience than the more diffusely organized dandelion. And the paper we just heard does wonderful work with this. And continuing to recognize the moral significance of these differences, process philosophers have alienated themselves from many potentially sympathetic philosophers. To take 2 examples, Val Plumwood is representative of those who wonder whether in retaining a hierarchy, process scholars have truly abandoned their anthropocentrism. She says, quote, "The criterion of experience builds in an anthropocentric hierarchy, since it conceives the world of nature as similar to, but a lesser degree than, the human mind, rather than as simply different. Such a position seems to offer little prospect of a real challenge to the thesis that the natural world is inferior to the human sphere, depending as it does on the extension in a weakened form of properties which are exemplified most fully by the human mind," end quote. Although process scholars claim, she says, to abandon anthropocentrism, their axiological hierarchy seems to suggest otherwise. Humans are still at the top. It's still, she says, the same thing, and I'm ignoring her difference claim here, but focusing on hierarchy. The refusal to repudiate hierarchical thinking has also been the chief point of contention between process scholars and deep ecologists, who otherwise maintain a fundamentally similar view of reality as an interdependent system of intrinsically valuable individuals. Deep ecologists such as John Rodman, George Sessions, and Bill Duvall claim that by insisting on a complex hierarchy of value, Whiteheadian moral philosophy is simply a thinly veiled anthropocentrism that will always put humans on top. Read the passage there from John Rodman, and there are others. Process philosophy claims to move beyond anthropocentrism, but it ultimately fails because it continues to embrace the conception of values that puts humans at its peak. Deep ecologists such as Duvall and Sessions then insist that the only way to fully repudiate anthropocentrism is to embrace the intuition of ecological egalitarianism, as they call it, whereby every individual not only has value, but has value equally. The response to these criticisms have not been lacking. For his part, John Cobb has noted consistently and vehemently that it is a misunderstanding to suggest, as Plumwood does, that process thought is anthropocentric in the sense that it judges the value of an individual by its similarity to humans, which part of her claim is. The depth of value achievable by an individual is a function of the complexity of its integration, not its similarity to humans. Humans are more valuable because of their greater degree of complexity, which affords them a richer form of experience. It is this richer experience, this more inclusive, harmonious, and intense experience that makes humans capable of greater beauty, more valuable than simpler organisms. The hierarchy of beauty and value, in other words, is not construed in terms of how similar an individual is to us. So this, I think, is just a misunderstanding that you do nicely. I think, though, that there's a more subtle problem with the deep ecologists. Because here, the problem has not to do only with the relative location of humans within the axiological hierarchy, but also the use to which this ontological hierarchy and this axiological hierarchy is put. It's the use, I think, that they're objecting to. In his more recent work, the 2007 book, Griffin takes a rather creative approach to the long-standing impasse between process philosophy and deep ecology. He suggests that the intuition of biocentric equality that some deep ecologists are after is in fact something that process scholars can embrace alongside a hierarchical conception of value in which not all individuals have equal value. Griffin executes some of his really impressive mental contortionism by making a distinction between intrinsic value, which varies based on an individual's complexity, and what he calls inherent value, which is an individual's total value if you take its extrinsic sort of instrumental value and combine it with its intrinsic value. So he invents a new term to combine intrinsic and extrinsic value together. Griffin notes that given the inverse relationship between an individual's intrinsic value and its extrinsic value, that the more complex something has, the less useful it is, and the less complex something is, the more instrumentally important it is. Grass is more instrumentally important than it is intrinsically important. There's an inverse relationship. He says if we notice this, those individuals that have less intrinsic value because of their diminished complexity end up having greater extrinsic value within their ecological niche. Thus, he says, taking the individual's total intrinsic and extrinsic value together, Griffin argues that each individual's total inherent value is roughly equal. So he's trying to get at the same intuition of equality that the deep ecologists are after. Cobb's and Griffin's solutions are insightful and fully consistent with process thought. Cobb is right that it is a misunderstanding to claim that process thought is anthropocentric. Right? Griffin's work is also very helpful in pointing out that we must include both an individual's intrinsic value and its intrinsic and extrinsic value in understanding its overall worth. But despite its unpopularity among environmental philosophers and some ecofeminists, process philosophers should steadfastly recognize that in fact different individuals are capable of different degrees of value. So I'm in agreement with their basic position, but I think there's still a problem. There's a reason why their accounts have failed to persuade others. The problem, I contend, is that they continue to fall short of fully addressing this core disagreement. They failed, and this is, sorry, I should have not added my commentaries along the way. The problem is that in maintaining a use of the hierarchy of value to justify something's moral significance, it's the solution that Griffin is suggesting is still not going to work. If you suggest that because humans are this much more complex, it's because of that we're justified in giving preference to their interests, right? If you make ontological status equivalent to moral significance, then you're doing essentially the same thing that traditional ontological hierarchies have done, which does violence to does nature to simpler beings. But I don't think this is necessary. If you take beauty as the aim of process, then each opportunity for action, if we say we should maximize beauty here now, then that may mean preferencing the interests of higher individuals, but it may not. Our goal is to maximize beauty, not to preference the interests of more complicated beings. So you make something's ontological significance morally relevant, but not morally constitutive. It maintains the use of an ontological hierarchy, but it now is hopefully no longer invidious. It's relevant, important, helping to constitute moral significance, but ultimately our goal is to maximize beauty, which sometimes means sacrificing the interests of the more complex individuals. So I'm hoping that will be a way to make a bridge to these very sympathetic and important traditions as an avenue for developing Whitehead's thought by embracing beauty rather than running from it. I think Whitehead becomes more relevant. Thank you. Thank you.
There's a story well told by paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould about the ichneumon wasp who disabuses of any fuzzy notions about beauty and nature. Among the endoparasitic ichneumons, the female pierces the host caterpillar or spider with their ovipositors, injects the eggs, and converts the host to a food factory for their young. Once the eggs hatch, the ichneumon larvae begin their grim work of interior excavation. Gould's paper was largely a response to 19th century English theologians' attempts to solve the problem of evil, which he thought displayed an amusing charm, but utterly failed to address the question of how a benevolent God could create such a world of carnage and bloodshed. But there's a continuum of such behavior from the insect world to the reptiles, mammals, and the human beings. A hungry shark devours a surfer in the dawn patrol of pristine waves. A pharmaceutical company plots the exploitation of sick patients as markets in a business plan to gain dominance in the market share, and a network of law firms feast on the body of a corporation for its misdeeds. All fall into the continuum. Whitehead was keen to the point. When he said in Process and Reality, life is robbery, I think Professor Henning knows this passage well. Just as a concressing actual occasion creates itself from the material of its immediate past, an organism robs its environment to eat and ensure the survival of its offspring. Such was the genius of Whitehead's power of generalization. The issue, it seems to me, is brute survival, not the lure of beauty, which is a luxurious option in special instances. Polite society is a conspiracy to conceal nature red in tooth and claw. So the moral philosopher's problem, how do we develop a moral theory from the brute fact of amoral nature? Since both Whitehead and Spinoza rejected the sharp dualism of humanity and nature, the burden then was to explain how we get a foundation for morality. Spinoza's ethics is an analytical theory rather than a normative one. He therefore describes the way things